In the depths of an ancient library, buried beneath centuries of dust and forgotten by time, lies the world's oldest story. A tale so powerful, so enduring, that it has whispered across 4,000 years to reach your ears tonight. Tonight, you're going to drift into sleep while experiencing the complete journey of humanity's first great hero, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Before you close your eyes, imagine clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks, pressed into wet earth by scribes who lived when the pyramids were young. These tablets held secrets that would remain lost for millennia, waiting in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia until a self-taught scholar named George Smith cracked their code in the 1870s. What he discovered changed everything we thought we knew about the origins of storytelling itself. This is not just any bedtime story. This is the story that taught humanity how to tell stories. Every hero's journey you've ever loved, every quest for meaning you've ever witnessed, every tale of friendship and loss that has ever moved you to tears traces its roots back to this ancient epic. Tonight, as your breathing slows and your mind begins to wander, you'll follow in the footsteps of the world's first literary hero, through adventures that establish the very foundations of human storytelling. The story you're about to hear survived the fall of empires, the burning of libraries, and the passage of 4,000 years, not because it was carefully preserved, but because it was so powerful that people couldn't stop telling it. Scribes copied it, travelers carried it, and poets retold it across the ancient world. It influenced the stories of Noah's flood, the legends of Hercules, and countless other tales that would follow. But tonight, you'll hear it as it was meant to be heard, complete and unbroken, carrying you into dreams on the wings of humanity's oldest song. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where civilization first learned to write, and cities first rose from the earth, there stood a city called Uruk. Its walls stretched for miles, built from bricks baked under the blazing Mesopotamian sun. These weren't ordinary walls. They were monuments to human ambition, reaching toward the heavens like a crown of stone around the greatest city the world had ever known. Within these walls lived a king unlike any who had ruled before or would rule after. His name was Gilgamesh, and the blood of gods flowed through his veins. 2/3 divine, 1/3 mortal, he possessed strength that could shatter mountains and wisdom that could pierce the mysteries of existence itself. When he walked through the streets of Uruk, the very stones seemed to acknowledge his presence. His shoulders were broad enough to carry the weight of the world, his eyes sharp enough to see into the hearts of men, and his voice powerful enough to command the respect of both mortals and immortals. Yet for all his divine heritage, for all his magnificent strength and godlike beauty, Gilgamesh had become something terrible. Power without wisdom, strength without compassion, had transformed him into a tyrant whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his people. He took whatever he desired, claimed whatever caught his eye, and crushed anyone who dared oppose his will. The young men of Uruk trembled when called to serve in his armies, knowing they might never return. The young women wept when they heard his footsteps approaching, for no bride was safe from his desires, no family sacred enough to protect their daughters from his demands. The people of Uruk had once celebrated their king's strength. They had sung songs of his victories and boasted to neighboring cities about their mighty ruler. But now their songs had turned to lamentations, their boasts to bitter complaints whispered in the shadows. In their desperation, they lifted their voices to the heavens, sending prayers like smoke from burning incense toward the realm of the gods. High above in the celestial sphere, where the immortals dwelt in palaces of starlight and clouds, these prayers did not go unheard. The gods gathered in their divine council, their forms shimmering with otherworldly radiance as they debated what must be done about the king who had forgotten his humanity in his pursuit of godlike power. Anu, the Sky Father, spoke first, his voice like distant thunder rolling across infinite space. The people's suffering had reached even his lofty realm, and something had to be done about this king who abused the divine blood that flowed in his veins. But how do you humble a being who possesses the strength of gods and the pride of mortals combined? It was Aruru, the mother goddess, she who had shaped the first humans from clay with her own hands, who proposed the solution that would change everything. If Gilgamesh had grown strong in isolation, if his power had corrupted him because he had no equal to challenge him, then she would create an equal. Someone to match his strength, to challenge his will, to show him what it truly meant to be both divine and human. With hands that had crafted the very essence of humanity, Aruru reached down and gathered clay from the wildest places of the earth. Not the tame clay from riverbanks where humans dwelt, but the raw, untouched earth from the deepest wilderness. She mixed this clay with water from springs that had never known human touch, and from this primordial mixture, she began to shape a new kind of being. As her divine fingers worked the clay, Aruru whispered life into her creation. She gave him strength to match Gilgamesh's strength, courage to match his courage, and a heart that knew the value of what Gilgamesh had forgotten. But where Gilgamesh had been raised in palaces and taught the ways of civilization, this new being would know only the wild places of the world. Where Gilgamesh wore fine robes and golden ornaments, this creature would wear only his own hair, long and wild like a lion's mane. Where Gilgamesh commanded armies and ruled cities, this wild man would run with the gazelles and drink from streams shared with the beasts of the field. When Aruru breathed the final breath of life into her creation, he opened eyes that had never seen the inside of a building, spoke with a voice that had never uttered a civilized word, and stood on legs that would never know the feeling of walking on paved stone. His name would be Enkidu, and he would be everything that Gilgamesh was not, yet somehow his perfect equal in all the ways that mattered. While Gilgamesh ruled from his throne of cedar and gold, Enkidu roamed the endless grasslands beyond the city walls. He ran with herds of wild horses, their hoofbeats thundering across the plains like drumbeats echoing from the dawn of time. He wrestled with lions for sport, his laughter mixing with their roars as they tested each other's strength under the star-filled desert sky. The gazelles accepted him as one of their own, and he grazed alongside them in meadows where wildflowers painted the earth in colours that had no names in human language. For Enkidu, every sunrise brought new adventures, new discoveries, new friends among the creatures who shared his wild paradise. He knew the secret watering holes where the shyest animals came to drink at dawn. He understood the languages of the wind through grass and the songs that night birds sang to the moon. His world was vast and free, bounded only by the horizon and filled with the simple joys of existence lived according to nature's ancient rhythms. But this perfect wild existence could not last forever. The same force that had brought Enkidu into being, the same divine plan that had shaped him from clay and breath, would soon set in motion the events that would draw him away from his animal friends and toward a destiny he could never have imagined. In the settlements that dotted the edges of the wilderness, hunters had begun to tell strange stories around their evening fires. They spoke of a wild man who ran with the herds, who seemed to appear from nowhere to free animals caught in their traps, who could move through the forest without making a sound and disappear like morning mist when pursued. Some claimed he was the spirit of the woods, others a demon sent to torment those who tried to make their living from the wild creatures. But all agreed on one thing: his presence was making their work impossible. One hunter, braver or more desperate than the rest, decided to seek help from the great city of Uruk. He had heard tales of the mighty king who ruled there, and surely such a powerful ruler would know what to do about this mysterious creature who was disrupting the natural order of things. When this hunter arrived at the gates of Uruk, travel-stained and weary from his long journey, he was overwhelmed by the magnificence of what he saw. The walls rose before him like cliffs of baked brick, so high that clouds sometimes caught on their tops. The gates were massive portals, decorated with images of lions and bulls, speaking of the power and pride of those who dwelt within. Guards in bronze armor stood at attention, their spear points gleaming in the sunlight, their eyes alert for any sign of trouble. The hunter told his story to anyone who would listen, and word of the wild man eventually reached the ears of King Gilgamesh himself. But when the king heard this tale, he did not see a problem to be solved. Instead, his eyes lit up with an interest that those who knew him had learned to fear. Here was something new, something that might provide entertainment for a king who had grown bored with the easy conquests and simple pleasures that his power had brought him. Gilgamesh's solution was both clever and cruel, showing the calculating intelligence that made him so formidable a ruler. If this wild man lived like an animal, then perhaps what he needed was an introduction to human pleasures, human desires, human weaknesses. The king summoned one of the temple women, a priestess skilled in the arts of love and seduction, whose beauty was renowned throughout the city. Her name was Shamhat, and she was everything that Enkidu was not. Where he was wild and untamed, she was refined and cultivated. Where he knew only the simple truths of the natural world, she understood the complex desires and motivations that drove civilized humans. Where he had never known longing or want, she was expert in awakening both. When Gilgamesh explained what he wanted her to do, Shamhat accepted the task without question, understanding that the king's requests were not really requests at all, but commands wrapped in the silk of courtesy. So Shamhat prepared for a journey into the wilderness, packing perfumes and oils, fine fabrics and jewelry, all the tools of her trade as a priestess of love. She would venture beyond the walls of civilization, beyond the safety of the known world, to find this creature who ran with beasts and transform him into something altogether different. The hunter led her to a watering hole where the wild herds came to drink, a place of peace where predator and prey shared the life-giving water in temporary truce. They built a small shelter of branches and waited, knowing that patience was the key to their success. For 3 days they watched and waited, seeing deer and wild horses, lions and leopards, all manner of creatures, but no sign of the wild man the hunter had described. But on the 4th morning, as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose, the animals at the water's edge suddenly grew still. Their heads turned as one toward the grassland, their ears pricked forward, their nostrils flaring as they caught a scent that meant safety rather than danger. And then he appeared. Enkidu emerged from the tall grass like a figure from a dream, his long hair flowing behind him as he moved with the fluid grace of a creature perfectly at home in his environment. The animals parted to make room for him at the water's edge, showing none of the fear they would display in the presence of ordinary humans. As he knelt to drink, cupping the clear water in his hands, Shamhat caught her breath at the sight of him. This was no ordinary man, wild or otherwise. Even in his primitive state, even covered with the dust of his wandering and wearing nothing but his own magnificent hair, there was something about him that spoke of power, of nobility, of a nature as pure and untainted as the wilderness that had shaped him. This was the being that the gods had created to match mighty Gilgamesh, and looking at him now, Shamhat could begin to understand why. The hunter whispered urgently to Shamhat, pointing toward the magnificent figure kneeling by the water. "There he is," he breathed, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of water against the muddy bank. "That's the wild man who's been freeing my snares and leading the animals away from my nets." Shamhat studied Enkidu carefully, her trained eye taking in every detail of his appearance and behavior. She watched how the gazelles pressed close to him without fear, how his movements flowed with the same natural rhythm as the wind through grass, how he seemed to belong to this wild place as completely as the trees belonged to the earth. This would not be a simple seduction of some lonely shepherd or wandering merchant. This was something altogether different, something that would require all her skill and patience. For 7 days and 7 nights, Shamhat waited at the edge of the watering place, learning the patterns of Enkidu's movements, understanding the rhythm of his days. She saw how he rose with the sun and moved through the grasslands with the herds, how he rested during the heat of midday in whatever shade he could find, how he returned to the water as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. She began to understand that he was not merely a man living among animals, but something far more complex, a being who existed in perfect harmony with the natural world around him. When she finally revealed herself, stepping from her hiding place among the reeds as Enkidu approached the water alone in the soft light of evening, the effect was immediate and profound. He stopped as if struck by lightning, his eyes widening at the sight of something he had never encountered before. Here was beauty of an entirely different kind from anything in his wild world, a creature whose very presence seemed to shimmer with mystery and promise. Shamhat spoke to him in low, melodic tones, her voice carrying across the water like music. She did not expect him to understand her words, but she knew that tone and gesture could communicate what language could not. She moved toward him slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a magnificent wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. But Enkidu did not run. Instead, he stood transfixed, caught between curiosity and an awakening desire he had no words to name. What followed was a transformation as profound as birth itself. For 6 days and 7 nights, Shamhat taught Enkidu the mysteries of human love, the complex pleasures and pains that came with consciousness of self and other. She showed him sensations he had never imagined, emotions he had never felt, desires that awakened in him like flowers blooming in his heart. Under her gentle guidance, the wild man began to discover what it meant to be human. But transformation, once begun, could not be stopped or controlled. As Enkidu learned the ways of love, other changes began to manifest themselves. His body, which had always moved with the unconscious grace of a natural creature, began to carry itself differently. His eyes, which had always looked outward at the world around him, began to look inward as well, contemplating thoughts and feelings that grew more complex with each passing hour. On the 7th day, when Enkidu rose from their bed of soft grass and wildflowers, he discovered that something fundamental had changed. When he approached the herds of gazelles that had been his companions since childhood, they scattered before him in terror. The wild horses that had once raced beside him across the plains now snorted and reared when he came near. The lions that had wrestled with him in play now bared their fangs and warned him away with threatening roars. The animals could sense what Enkidu himself was only beginning to understand. He was no longer one of them. The innocence that had allowed him to live as a creature of pure instinct was gone, replaced by something more complex and more troubled. He had gained the gift of human consciousness, but in gaining it, he had lost his place in the paradise of the wild. Shamhat, seeing his confusion and distress, took his hands in hers and spoke to him with gentle authority. "Come," she said, her voice carrying new meaning now that his mind had opened to understand human speech. "You are no longer a creature of the wilderness. You have become a man, and men do not live alone among the beasts. Come with me to the city where you belong now. Come and meet others of your kind." And she told him of Uruk, the great city beyond the grasslands, with its magnificent walls and bustling streets, its temples that reached toward the heavens, and its markets filled with wonders from across the known world. She spoke of cooked food and woven cloth, of music and poetry, of all the achievements of human civilization that were now his birthright as a thinking, feeling human being. But most importantly, she told him of Gilgamesh, the mighty king who ruled over this paradise of human achievement. As she described the king's strength and beauty, his power and wisdom, Enkidu felt something stirring within him that he did not yet understand. It was not fear, though Gilgamesh sounded formidable beyond measure. It was not exactly curiosity, though he found himself eager to learn more. It was something deeper, more primal, a sense of recognition that seemed to come from the very core of his being. "This king," he said, his voice still rough with newness as he learned to shape human words. "Tell me more of him. What manner of man commands such power?" Shamhat's expression grew troubled as she spoke of Gilgamesh's tyranny, his abuse of power, his cruel treatment of the people who should have been able to look to him for protection. She told of young men forced into endless wars, of brides torn from their wedding chambers, of subjects who lived in fear of their own king's appetites and rages. As Enkidu listened to these stories, something new awakened within him, something as powerful as the love Shamhat had taught him but different in nature. It was righteous anger, moral outrage, a sense of justice that demanded action. The same divine spark that had made Gilgamesh a king had been placed within Enkidu, but where Gilgamesh's power had been corrupted by isolation and unchallenged authority, Enkidu's strength was tempered by his connection to all living things. "This cannot be allowed to continue," he declared, rising to his feet with newfound purpose burning in his eyes. "If this king has forgotten his duty to his people, then someone must remind him. If he believes his strength makes him above the laws that govern other men, then someone must show him otherwise." Shamhat recognized the determination in his voice, the same quality that had made him so formidable in the wild, now channeled toward a human purpose. She had succeeded in her mission perhaps too well. She had been sent to civilize the wild man, to make him harmless. But instead she had created something potentially more dangerous than he had ever been in his natural state. She had given him human consciousness and human moral sense, but he retained all the strength and courage that had made him master of the wilderness. The journey to Uruk took many days, and with each step along the dusty roads that led toward the great city, Enkidu learned more about the world of men. Shamhat taught him to walk upright with dignity, rather than moving with the fluid crouch of a creature always ready to spring into action. She showed him how to eat bread and drink wine, how to wear clothes and ornaments, how to speak and behave in ways that would not mark him immediately as a stranger to civilization. But even as his external appearance transformed, becoming more polished and refined with each lesson, the fire of purpose that burned within him only grew stronger. The closer they came to Uruk, the more stories he heard of Gilgamesh's excesses, and the more determined he became to confront this king who had forgotten the responsibilities that came with power. Other travelers on the road spoke in hushed tones of the latest royal decree, of another young woman claimed for the king's pleasure, of another family destroyed by his casual cruelty. With each tale, Enkidu's jaw tightened and his hands clenched into fists that could crush stone. The strength that had once been used to wrestle lions in play was now focused on a single, burning purpose. When the walls of Uruk finally appeared on the horizon, rising from the desert like a vision from a dream, Enkidu stopped in his tracks and stared. Nothing in his wild upbringing had prepared him for such a sight. The walls stretched further than his eyes could follow, built from countless bricks, baked to the hardness of stone, decorated with images of gods and heroes that seemed to watch over the approaches to the city. Gates of cedar and bronze stood open, with guards in gleaming armor checking the credentials of those who sought entry. "This is where he lives?" Enkidu asked, his voice filled with wonder despite his anger. "This Gilgamesh, this king who thinks himself above the laws of gods and men?" "This is his kingdom," Shamhat replied, "and every brick in those walls was laid by the sweat of his subjects, every decoration crafted by artisans whose children go hungry while he feasts in his palace." As they approached the gates, the guards looked with curiosity at this newcomer, whose bearing suggested nobility despite his obvious unfamiliarity with city ways. There was something about Enkidu that commanded attention and respect, a presence that spoke of power held in check but ready to be unleashed if necessary. The streets of Uruk were a revelation to eyes that had known only the endless spaces of the wilderness. Narrow alleys wound between buildings that rose like cliffs on either side, shutting out the sky and creating a maze of shadows and echoes. The air was filled with sounds Enkidu had never heard. The ring of hammers on anvils, the calls of merchants hawking their wares, the rumble of cartwheels on stone, the thousand voices of a great city going about its daily business. But beneath all the noise and bustle, Enkidu sensed something else. Something that his wild-trained senses could detect even here among the overwhelming sensations of urban life. There was fear in this city, fear that hung in the air like smoke from a fire that burned just out of sight. The people moved with the careful alertness of prey animals, always watching, always listening, always ready to disappear into doorways or side streets if danger appeared. And that danger, Enkidu knew, wore a crown and sat upon a throne somewhere in the heart of this magnificent, terrifying city. The palace of Gilgamesh rose from the center of Uruk, like a mountain of carved stone and precious metals, its towers reaching toward the heavens, as if challenging the gods themselves to acknowledge the power of the king who dwelt within. Every surface gleamed with gold and lapis lazuli. Every column bore intricate carvings that told the stories of royal victories and divine favor. Gardens, filled with exotic trees and flowers from distant lands, surrounded the main structure, their beauty maintained by armies of servants whose only purpose was to ensure that their king's eyes never fell upon anything less than perfection. Within these opulent halls, Gilgamesh held court with the casual arrogance of one who had never known defeat, never faced a challenge that his strength could not overcome, never encountered a will that could match his own. He reclined on a throne carved from a single block of cedar, its arms shaped like lions, whose eyes were rubies that seemed to burn within a fire. Courtiers surrounded him, men and women whose lives depended on their ability to anticipate his moods, to flatter his ego, to provide him with the constant adulation that fed his sense of superiority over all other mortals. But even surrounded by luxury and praise, even wielding power that could reshape kingdoms with a word, Gilgamesh felt the gnawing emptiness that comes to those who have everything and find it insufficient. He had conquered every enemy, bedded every beauty, accumulated every treasure that his heart had desired, and yet something was missing, some essential experience that remained just beyond his reach. He was bored, restless, like a caged lion pacing behind bars too strong to break but too confining to ignore. It was in this state of dangerous ennui that news reached him of the wild man who had been civilized by temple arts and was now walking the streets of his city. The courtiers who brought this information spoke in hushed, excited tones, their eyes bright with the kind of anticipation that comes when something genuinely new disturbs the predictable routine of palace life. They described a man of extraordinary size and strength, whose very presence seemed to change the atmosphere wherever he appeared, who moved through the city like a force of nature barely contained in human form. Where did he come from? Gilgamesh demanded, leaning forward on his throne with the first genuine interest he had shown in months. Who is this stranger who dares enter my city without my permission? The reports were fragmentary and contradictory, as such reports always are when ordinary people encounter something extraordinary. Some claimed the stranger had emerged from the wilderness like a figure from legend, that animals followed him through the streets and birds perched on his shoulders without fear. Others insisted he was a warrior from some distant kingdom, come to challenge the king's authority through combat. Still others whispered that he might be a god in disguise, testing the righteousness of the mortal rulers through deception. But all agreed on certain essential facts. The stranger was tall as a cedar tree and broad as a bull, with eyes that held the depth of ancient forests and a voice that could command attention without being raised. He moved with the fluid grace of one who had never known fear, never doubted his own strength, never questioned his right to walk wherever his feet chose to carry him. And most intriguingly of all, he had been asking questions about the king, seeking to understand the nature of the man who ruled over this great city. Gilgamesh found himself consumed with curiosity about this mysterious figure. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he faced the possibility of encountering someone who might prove interesting, someone who might provide the challenge and stimulation that his soul craved. The very uncertainty of it thrilled him in ways that all his certain victories never could. Here was something unknown, untested, unpredictable. Meanwhile, Enkidu moved through the streets of Uruk like a man in a waking dream, his senses overwhelmed by the complexity of civilized life, while his mind struggled to process the moral implications of what he observed. Every corner revealed new wonders and new horrors, often existing side by side, in ways that his simple forest upbringing had never prepared him to understand. In the marketplace, he saw merchants selling goods crafted with skill that surpassed anything he had imagined possible. Metal workers shaped bronze and iron into tools and weapons of surpassing beauty, their surfaces decorated with patterns that seemed to capture the very essence of flowing water and dancing flames. Textile workers displayed fabrics dyed in colors more brilliant than any flower, woven with threads so fine they might have been spun from moonbeams and morning mist. But he also saw the hollow eyes of slaves who bore the burdens while their masters counted profits, the bent backs of workers whose strength was being consumed to feed the appetites of those who contributed nothing but ownership to the great machine of commerce. He witnessed the casual cruelty with which the strong exploited the weak, the way power flowed always upward while suffering settled like sediment among those least able to bear it. Children ran through the streets in games that mimicked the adult world around them, playing at being merchants and soldiers, kings and servants. But even in their innocent play, Enkidu could see the patterns being established, the way they were learning to accept hierarchy and inequality as natural features of existence rather than choices made by those with the power to choose differently. The deeper he penetrated into the city, the more clearly he could see the shadow that Gilgamesh's rule cast over every aspect of life in Uruk. The king's presence was everywhere, not just in the official proclamations and royal statues, but in the way people carried themselves, the topics they avoided in conversation, the careful manner in which they expressed opinions that might be construed as criticism. It was the fear of a population that had learned to anticipate their rulers' moods, to shape their behavior around the demands of a man whose desires were law and whose displeasure could mean destruction. This was not the natural respect that a good king earned through wisdom and justice, but the forced submission that tyrants demanded through strength and intimidation. As evening approached and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Enkidu of the wild sunsets he had watched from grassland hilltops, he found himself drawn toward the sound of celebration. Music and laughter echoed from a great hall near the center of the city, and the streets filled with people dressed in their finest garments, all moving in the same direction. "What celebration is this?" Enkidu asked a passing merchant, a man whose fine robes and numerous rings spoke of prosperity earned through successful trade. The merchant's expression darkened, and he glanced around nervously before answering in lowered tones. "It is a wedding feast," he said, "though there is little joy in it for the families involved. The king has claimed his right to the bride before her husband may know her, as is his custom with all marriages in the city." Enkidu felt something cold and terrible settle in his stomach, a rage so pure and focused that it seemed to burn away every other emotion. "His right," he repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "By what law does a king claim such a right?" "By the law of strength," the merchant replied bitterly. "By the law that says those with power may take whatever they desire from those without. It has been so since Gilgamesh became king, and none dare oppose him." "None?" Enkidu asked, and something in his tone made the merchant look at him more carefully, noting for the first time the coiled strength in his frame, the dangerous light in his eyes. "None," the merchant confirmed, then added more quietly, "though there are many who pray each night that someday someone will." Enkidu needed no further explanation, no additional motivation. The purpose that had been growing within him since he first heard tales of Gilgamesh's tyranny crystallized into diamond-hard resolution. The wild man who had wrestled lions for sport, who had known no law but the natural justice of the wilderness, who had been shaped by the gods themselves to serve as a counterbalance to corrupted power, would not stand idle while innocence was violated and justice perverted. He followed the crowd toward the great hall, where the wedding feast was being held, his stride lengthening with each step, his massive hands clenching and unclenching as he prepared himself for what was to come. Around him, the people of Uruk continued their reluctant celebration, going through the motions of joy while their hearts burned with impotent rage and sorrow. The hall itself was a marvel of architecture and decoration, its walls covered with murals depicting the glory of Uruk's kings and the prosperity of their reign. Hundreds of oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the painted scenes, creating the illusion that the figures themselves were moving, celebrating eternally in their frozen world of art and propaganda. Long tables groaned under the weight of food and wine, enough to feed a small army, all provided at the king's expense, as if generosity in celebration could somehow balance the cruelty of the custom being observed. At the head of the hall, on a platform that elevated him above all others, sat Gilgamesh himself. Even in repose, even in the midst of what was supposed to be festivity, he radiated power like heat from a forge fire. His presence dominated the vast space, drawing every eye, commanding every attention, making it impossible to forget even for a moment who ruled here and by whose will this gathering existed. The king wore robes of deep purple silk embroidered with threads of gold, and upon his brow rested a crown that caught the lamplight and threw it back in brilliant flashes that hurt to look upon directly. His black hair was bound with ribbons of silver, and rings of precious metals adorned his fingers, each one a work of art in itself. But it was not his finery that made him so commanding a presence. It was the aura of absolute authority that surrounded him, the sense that here was a man who had never been told no, never been denied anything he wanted, never been forced to consider the wishes or welfare of others when making his decisions. Every line of his body spoke of confidence so complete it had become arrogance, strength so overwhelming it had forgotten the existence of weakness, power so absolute it had lost all connection to responsibility. Beside the king's throne, trembling like a flower in a storm wind, sat the bride whose marriage was being celebrated and violated simultaneously. She was young, perhaps no more than 16 summers, with the kind of fresh beauty that speaks of innocence about to be destroyed. Her wedding dress, which should have been the most joyful garment she would ever wear, seemed instead like a shroud, its white silk emphasizing the pallor of her face and the terror in her dark eyes. Her new husband sat at a lower table, his own face a mask of controlled rage and helpless despair. This should have been the happiest day of his life, the culmination of months of preparation and years of dreaming. Instead, he was forced to watch as his bride was claimed by another, powerless to defend her, knowing that any protest would bring not just his own death, but probably hers as well. The feast continued around this tableau of barely controlled tragedy, guests going through the motions of celebration, while the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing moment. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone understood the script of this particular royal prerogative, and everyone felt the weight of their own complicity in allowing it to continue. It was into this atmosphere of forced festivity and suppressed horror that Enkidu strode, his massive frame filling the doorway of the great hall like an avatar of divine judgment. Conversations died away as he entered. The music faltered and stopped, and hundreds of pairs of eyes turned to stare at this stranger, whose very presence seemed to change the nature of the gathering. He walked forward through the suddenly silent hall, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor with the steady rhythm of approaching destiny. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but there was nothing furtive or sneaking about his approach. This was the walk of one who had every right to be where he was, who feared no challenge and anticipated no opposition that he could not overcome. Gilgamesh, from his elevated throne, watched this stranger's approach with growing interest and amusement. Here was something new, something that promised to relieve the tedium of yet another predictable evening of royal privilege and enforced celebration. The man was impressive, certainly, with a build that suggested formidable strength and a bearing that spoke of natural nobility. But he was still just a man, and Gilgamesh had never met a man who could match him in any contest that mattered. "Who dares interrupt the king's feast?" Gilgamesh called out, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall, rich with authority and tinged with the kind of amusement that a cat might show when a particularly bold mouse ventures too close to its claws. Enkidu stopped before the royal platform, looking up at the king with eyes that held no trace of the fear or deference that Gilgamesh was accustomed to seeing in the faces of those who approached his throne. Instead, there was something else there, something that the king had not encountered in so long that it took him a moment to recognize it. It was judgment, the calm, steady gaze of one who looked upon power and found it wanting. "I am Enkidu," he replied, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "and I come to prevent an injustice." A murmur ran through the assembled guests, a sound like wind through dry leaves, as they absorbed the implications of what they had just heard. Someone, at last, was challenging the king directly, openly, without apology or qualification. The impossible was happening before their eyes. Gilgamesh leaned forward on his throne, his amusement deepening but taking on a harder edge. "An injustice," he repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it strange. "In my own hall, during my own feast. What injustice could there possibly be when everything here occurs according to my will and pleasure?" "The injustice of power without wisdom," Enkidu replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The injustice of strength used to oppress rather than protect. The injustice of a king who has forgotten that his authority exists to serve his people, not to exploit them for his own gratification." Yes, the silence in the hall was now so complete that it seemed to have weight, pressing down on everyone present like the air before a tremendous storm. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe as they witnessed something that many had dreamed of but none had believed they would ever see. Someone standing before Gilgamesh and speaking truth to power. The young bride looked up from her position beside the throne, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since the wedding ceremony had begun. Her husband half rose from his seat, his face a mixture of disbelief and desperate optimism. Throughout the hall, the oppressed and downtrodden felt something stirring in their hearts that they had thought was dead forever. But Gilgamesh himself seemed more intrigued than angered by this unprecedented challenge. He studied Enkidu with the attention of a connoisseur examining a particularly interesting work of art, taking in every detail of his appearance and bearing, measuring his strength and trying to understand his motivations. "You speak boldly for a stranger in a strange land," the king said finally, his tone still more curious than threatening. "Tell me, Enkidu of nowhere, what gives you the right to judge the actions of a king? What authority do you claim that permits you to stand in my hall and speak of justice as if you understood what the word means?" "I claim no authority, but that which the gods have given to every man with a conscience," Enkidu replied. "I speak of justice because I have lived among creatures who know no cruelty, who take only what they need, and harm none except in fair combat. I have seen what the world looks like when strength serves life, rather than dominating it. And I will not stand silent while that balance is perverted." For a moment something flickered in Gilgamesh's eyes, something that might have been recognition or memory, or perhaps just the ghost of emotions he had thought long dead. But it was gone almost before it could be identified, replaced by the cold amusement of a predator that has found worthy prey. "How refreshing," the king said, rising slowly from his throne, his full height revealed as he straightened to his imposing stature. "It has been so long since anyone has entertained me with such bold foolishness. Very well, Enkidu of the wilderness. If you believe yourself qualified to judge kings and speak of justice, then perhaps you would care to demonstrate the strength that gives weight to your words." The challenge hung in the air between them, as clear and sharp as a drawn blade. Around the hall, the guests held their breath, knowing that they were about to witness something unprecedented in the history of Uruk. For the first time in living memory, someone had not only challenged Gilgamesh's authority, but had been invited to back up that challenge with action. Enkidu looked up at the king, this man-god whose tyranny had cast such a long shadow over the lives of countless innocent people, and felt the last of his civilized restraints fall away. The wild strength that had been his birthright, the divine power that Aruru had breathed into his clay form, the righteous anger that had been building since he first learned of Gilgamesh's crimes, all merged into a single focused purpose. "I accept your challenge," he said, his voice carrying the finality of an avalanche, the inevitability of a river reaching the sea. "Let us see whether the strength of the wilderness can match the power of the palace, whether justice can triumph over tyranny, whether a king who has forgotten his humanity can be reminded of it by one who has just discovered his own." The two titans faced each other across the suddenly charged atmosphere of the great hall, and everyone present knew that whatever happened next would echo through the ages, becoming the stuff of legend, the moment when the very foundations of power and authority were put to their ultimate test. The great hall of Uruk had witnessed many spectacles throughout its history, royal banquets where tribute flowed like rivers from conquered lands, victory celebrations where enemy kings knelt in chains before the cedar throne, wedding feasts where alliances between noble houses were forged in gold and sealed with wine. But never had these ancient stones witnessed anything like what was about to unfold. Gilgamesh descended from his platform with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, each step deliberate and measured. His purple robes rippled around his massive frame like water around a stone, and the golden threads in the fabric caught the lamplight and threw it back in patterns that seemed almost alive. The crown upon his brow no longer seemed merely ornamental, but rather like some ancient weapon forged in celestial fire, ready to burn any who dared look upon it with disrespect. As the king moved toward the center of the hall, servants scattered like leaves before a storm wind, carrying tables and chairs out of the way with the practiced efficiency of those who understood that their lives depended on anticipating their master's needs. The marble floor, polished to mirror brightness, reflected the dancing flames of 100 oil lamps, creating the illusion that both combatants walked on a surface of liquid fire. Enkidu stepped forward to meet him, shedding the last vestiges of the civilized behavior that Shamat had taught him during their journey to the city. The fine clothes she had helped him choose fell away like a snake's shed skin, revealing the magnificent physique that the mother goddess had crafted from wilderness clay and divine breath. His muscles rippled beneath skin, bronzed by countless days under the desert sun. And his hair, unbound now from its civilized constraints, flowed around his shoulders like a dark waterfall. The two men began to circle each other in the cleared space at the heart of the hall, their movements creating a deadly dance that spoke of power barely contained, of forces that had been building toward this moment since the first breath of creation. Neither rushed toward immediate confrontation. Both understood instinctively that this was not a mere brawl between common men, but something far more significant. A clash that would determine not just who possessed superior strength, but which vision of power and authority would prevail in the world. Gilgamesh moved with the calculated precision of a warrior trained from birth in every form of combat known to civilized man. His footwork spoke of countless hours spent with the greatest masters of war, learning to read an opponent's intentions in the shift of a shoulder, the placement of a foot, the angle of approach. Every muscle in his body was disciplined, controlled, ready to explode into action when the moment demanded it. But Enkidu's movement was something altogether different, something that no human teacher could have instructed and no amount of practice could have perfected. He moved with the fluid unpredictability of wind through tall grass, the sudden explosive power of a lion's spring, the patient stalking grace of a leopard hunting in moonlight. His combat knowledge came not from human instructors, but from wrestling with the very forces of nature itself, from testing his strength against creatures who knew no mercy and offered no quarter. The first contact between them came without warning, as Gilgamesh suddenly lunged forward with the speed of striking lightning, his hands reaching for Enkidu's throat with the intention of ending the contest before it could truly begin. But the wild man's reflexes, honed by years of survival in a world where a moment's inattention meant death, served him well. He twisted aside at the last instant, letting the king's momentum carry him past, then spun and caught Gilgamesh around the waist with arms that could crush the ribs of a bull. For a heartbeat, the two titans stood locked together, straining against each other with forces that would have shattered ordinary men like pottery. The marble beneath their feet began to crack under the pressure of their struggle, spiderweb fractures spreading outward from where they stood. The very air around them seemed to thicken and pulse with the energy of their conflict. Gilgamesh, finding himself caught in a grip that matched his own legendary strength, felt something he had not experienced since childhood: the shock of encountering a force that could not be simply overwhelmed through superior power. For the first time in decades, he was being tested by an equal, challenged by someone whose divine heritage matched his own. The revelation was both thrilling and terrifying, awakening emotions he had thought buried forever beneath layers of cynicism and cruelty. But if the king was surprised by Enkidu's strength, he was far from defeated. With a roar that shook the very pillars of the hall, he drove his knee upward toward his opponent's ribs, while simultaneously bringing his elbow down toward the base of Enkidu's skull. The wild man, however, had faced the charge of angry bulls and the strike of giant serpents, and his body moved almost without conscious thought to avoid the crushing blows. They broke apart and circled again, both breathing hard now, both marked with the sweat of genuine effort for the first time in years. Around them, the wedding guests pressed back against the walls, their eyes wide with wonder and terror as they watched these two forces of nature test themselves against each other. The young bride had risen from her seat beside the abandoned throne, her hands pressed to her mouth, hardly daring to hope that her salvation might actually be unfolding before her eyes. The second engagement was even more violent than the first. Enkidu launched himself forward, like a boulder rolling down a mountainside, his massive frame covering the distance between them in two powerful strides. Gilgamesh met the charge head-on, and the impact, when they collided, sent shockwaves through the hall that rattled the oil lamps in their brackets and caused several of the painted murals to crack along their edges. They grappled with the fury of natural disasters, each seeking to find a hold that would allow him to bring his full strength to bear. Gilgamesh wrapped his arms around Enkidu's torso and lifted him from the ground, intending to dash him against the marble floor with crushing force. But the wild man twisted in his grip like a serpent, using the momentum of the lift to wrap his legs around the king's waist and lock his hands behind his opponent's neck. Now it was Gilgamesh who found himself caught in an unbreakable hold. His own strength turned against him as Enkidu's grip tightened like the coils of a python. The king's face began to darken as the wild man's arms compressed his throat, cutting off the flow of air to his lungs. Panic flickered in his eyes for just a moment before his warrior's training reasserted itself. With desperate strength, Gilgamesh drove himself backward, slamming Enkidu against one of the great pillars that supported the hall's roof. The impact was tremendous, sending cracks running up the column's length and causing chunks of carved stone to rain down upon the wrestling titans. But still, Enkidu held on, his grip unshakable as mountain roots, his determination absolute as the turning of the seasons. Again and again, Gilgamesh hammered his opponent against the pillar, each impact loosening more stone, each crash echoing through the hall like thunder. But with each blow, he felt his own strength beginning to ebb, his lungs screaming for the air that Enkidu's relentless grip denied him. The wild man, meanwhile, seemed to draw power from the violence itself, his muscles growing harder rather than weaker as the contest continued. Finally, with a surge of strength that came from the very core of his being, Gilgamesh managed to tear himself free, stumbling backward across the cracked marble as he gasped for precious air. Enkidu dropped to his feet like a cat, apparently unaffected by the tremendous punishment he had just absorbed, his eyes burning with the fierce joy of combat against a worthy opponent. They faced each other across the ruined center of the hall, both bloodied now, both pushed to limits they had not tested in years. Gilgamesh's purple robes hung in tatters, revealing the magnificent physique beneath, while Enkidu's bronzed skin bore the marks of their struggle like war paint, applied by the gods themselves. But something had changed in the quality of their conflict. Where before there had been anger and challenge, now there was something that might almost have been recognition. Each had found in the other what he had been seeking without knowing it, a reflection of his own divine nature, a mirror that showed him what he truly was beneath all the layers of civilization or wildness that had shaped his life. The third and final phase of their battle began not with the explosive violence of the earlier exchanges, but with a slow, careful approach that spoke of mutual respect earned through combat. They moved toward each other like dancers following some ancient choreography, their hands extended, seeking not to destroy but to test, to measure, to understand. When they came together this time, it was with the measured precision of master craftsmen working on their greatest creation. Hand locked against hand, shoulder pressed against shoulder, they strained against each other with forces that would have moved mountains, yet neither sought to end the contest quickly through trickery or sudden violence. This was pure strength against pure strength, will against will, the divine essence of each testing itself against its equal. Slowly, incredibly slowly, they began to turn in a circle, neither able to overcome the other, both pouring everything they possessed into this ultimate test. The marble beneath their feet continued to crack and split, creating a spiral pattern that spread outward from their struggle like ripples on the surface of a pond. Their breathing became labored, then desperate, as muscles that had never known defeat began to tremble with the effort of maintaining their impossible contest. Time seemed to slow and stop around them. The wedding guests, the flickering oil lamps, the cracked walls and broken pillars all faded into insignificance beside this primal struggle between two forces that represented the very essence of power and strength. They were no longer merely two men fighting in a palace hall, but living symbols of all the great conflicts that had shaped the world since its beginning. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Neither had defeated the other. Neither had proven superior, but both had reached the absolute limit of what divine strength could accomplish in mortal flesh. They stood locked together, trembling with exhaustion, their faces inches apart, their eyes looking deep into each other's souls. What they saw there changed everything. Gilgamesh saw not an enemy or a rival, but a brother, someone who shared his divine heritage and understood the terrible burden that came with strength beyond mortal comprehension. In Enkidu's wild eyes, he glimpsed the innocence he had lost, the connection to the natural world that his civilized upbringing had denied him, the pure heart that power had not yet corrupted. Enkidu, looking into the king's face, saw not the tyrant he had expected to confront, but a man whose cruelty came from loneliness, whose tyranny was born of the desperate attempt to fill an emptiness that no amount of power could satisfy. Behind the cold authority and calculated cruelty, he glimpsed a soul that hungered for exactly what he himself had found in the wilderness, a place where he belonged, a purpose that matched his nature. a companion who could understand the unique challenges of bearing divine strength in a mortal world. Slowly, as if moving through water thick as honey, they released their holds on each other and stepped back. Their chests rose and fell with the deep breathing of warriors who had pushed themselves beyond endurance, and their bodies bore the marks of their titanic struggle. But their eyes held something that had not been there before, a recognition that transcended victory or defeat. The great hall of Uruk fell silent as the tomb of kings, every eye fixed on these two figures who had just redefined what was possible in the world of mortal men. The young bride still stood beside the abandoned throne, her wedding dress torn and stained, but her face radiant with hope. Her husband had moved closer during the battle, and now stood ready to reclaim what was his by right, if the gods had truly answered his prayers. Gilgamesh looked around the ruined hall, seeing it as if for the first time. The cracked pillars, the frightened faces of his subjects, the atmosphere of fear and oppression that his rule had created. All of it appeared to him now with the clarity that comes only after great struggle has burned away illusion and pretense. The man who had entered this hall as an absolute monarch emerged from combat as someone fundamentally changed. Someone who had found what he had been seeking in the last place he would have thought to look. He turned to the young bride, this girl whose terror had been the catalyst for the night's transformative events, and for the first time in years spoke words that came from compassion rather than command. "Go to your husband," he said simply, his voice carrying none of its usual imperial authority, but rather the quiet strength of one who has discovered what true power means. The wedding feast belongs to those who celebrate love, not to those who would corrupt it. The girl's face transformed with joy so pure it seemed to illuminate the entire hall. She ran to her husband's arms, and their embrace spoke of gratitude too deep for words, of love redeemed from the very edge of destruction. Around them, the wedding guests began to murmur among themselves, hardly able to believe what they had witnessed, barely daring to hope that this moment of mercy might signal a greater change in their king's heart. But Enkidu and Gilgamesh had attention only for each other, these two beings who had found in combat what they had failed to discover in all their previous experiences. They approached each other again, but this time without hostility, their movements speaking of recognition rather than challenge. "Who are you?" Gilgamesh asked, though he felt he already knew the answer in some deep part of his soul. "From whence do you come, and why have the gods sent you to my hall at this moment?" "I am what you have been missing," Enkidu replied, his voice still rough from the battle, but carrying a truth that resonated through the very air around them. "I am the brother you never had, the equal you have sought without knowing you sought it, the mirror in which you can see yourself as you truly are rather than as power has made you." And with those words, something that had been broken in both of them began to heal. The loneliness that had driven Gilgamesh to cruelty, the isolation that had made him forget his responsibilities to his people, the emptiness that no amount of conquest or indulgence had been able to fill, all of it began to transform in the presence of someone who truly understood what it meant to bear the strength of gods in the heart of a man. They embraced then, these two titans who had sought to destroy each other and instead had found salvation, and their brotherhood was forged in that moment, with bonds stronger than bronze, deeper than the roots of mountains, more enduring than the walls of Uruk itself. The wild man and the king, the creature of nature and the master of civilization, had become something greater together than either had been alone. The wedding guests watched in amazement as their terrifying monarch was transformed before their eyes into something they had never seen before. A man capable of friendship, someone whose strength could be tempered by love rather than corrupted by isolation. The young bride and her husband knelt before their king, not in fear now, but in gratitude, offering thanks for a mercy they had never dared hope to receive. But Gilgamesh had no attention for their gratitude, no interest in the political implications of what had just occurred. His entire focus was on this remarkable being who had entered his life like a lightning strike, illuminating everything that had been dark, warming everything that had been cold, filling the emptiness that had driven him to such desperate cruelty. "My friend," he said, and the word seemed to take on new meaning as he spoke it, becoming something sacred, something that connected him to purposes larger than his own desires. "My brother, my equal, my other self, what adventures await us now that we have found each other? What deeds shall we accomplish together that neither could have achieved alone?" Enkidu smiled, and in that smile was all the wild joy of the untamed places, all the fierce delight of lions playing in the morning sun, all the profound satisfaction that comes when the deepest longings of the heart are finally fulfilled. "Whatever the gods have planned for us," he replied, "we shall face it together. Whether it brings us glory or sorrow, triumph or tragedy, we shall meet it as brothers, as equals, as two who have become one." And so began the greatest friendship in the history of the world, forged in combat, tempered by recognition, and destined to become the stuff of legend. The wild man and the king, united now in purpose and affection, would soon embark on adventures that would shake the very foundations of the world, challenging gods and monsters, seeking glory and wisdom, learning together what it truly meant to be human in a universe that seemed designed to test the limits of mortal courage and divine ambition. But that night, in the great hall of Uruk, surrounded by the evidence of their titanic struggle and the witnesses to their transformative friendship, they simply held each other and marveled at the gift the gods had given them. For in finding each other, they had found themselves, and in accepting each other, they had discovered what it meant to be whole. The oil lamps flickered lower as the night deepened, casting dancing shadows on the cracked walls and broken pillars. The wedding guests gradually departed, carrying with them stories that would be told and retold for generations. Tales of the night when their tyrant king was transformed by friendship into something approaching the ruler he had always had the potential to become. The young bride and her husband returned to their wedding chamber, finally able to celebrate their union without fear, their love blessed by the mercy of a king who had remembered his humanity. And in the ruins of what had been a hall of oppression and fear, two friends sat together and planned the adventures that would make their names immortal, their deeds legendary, their friendship a beacon of hope for all who believed that even the mightiest could be redeemed through love, that even the strongest could be made stronger through companionship, that even the loneliest could find their way home through the miracle of true friendship. The Epic of Gilgamesh had truly begun, not with the introduction of its hero, but with the moment when that hero discovered he was not destined to walk through life alone. In finding Enkidu, Gilgamesh had found himself, and in their friendship lay the seeds of all the wonders and sorrows that would follow, all the glory and tragedy that would make their story immortal, all the wisdom and folly that would transform them from mere characters in an ancient tale into eternal symbols of what it means to be human in a world that demands both strength and compassion, both courage and humility, both individual greatness and the recognition that we are all, in the end, connected by bonds deeper than blood, stronger than death, more enduring than the very stones upon which civilizations are built. The days following their earth-shaking encounter passed like a dream for both friends, each discovering in the other dimensions of existence they had never imagined possible. Gilgamesh, who had spent his entire life surrounded by subjects who trembled at his approach, now found himself with someone who met his gaze as an equal, who challenged his thoughts not through rebellion, but through genuine curiosity and concern. For the first time since childhood, he experienced the joy of sharing rather than taking, of protecting rather than dominating. Enkidu, meanwhile, marveled at the complexities of civilized life through eyes that could appreciate both its wonders and its flaws, without the cynicism that comes from being born into its contradictions. He walked through the gardens of the palace, touching flowers that had been bred for beauty rather than survival, admiring fountains that existed purely to delight the senses, studying the intricate carvings that adorned every surface with scenes of triumph and celebration. Together they explored the city that Gilgamesh had ruled but never truly seen. The king discovered streets he had never walked, people whose names he had never learned, corners of his own kingdom that had remained invisible to him from the heights of his throne. Enkidu served as both guide and mirror, asking questions that forced Gilgamesh to examine assumptions he had never questioned, pointing out beauties that power had taught him to overlook. In the workshops of the metalworkers, they watched craftsmen shape bronze and iron, with skills passed down through generations, creating tools and weapons and ornaments that would outlast their makers. Enkidu marveled at the patience required to perfect such techniques, while Gilgamesh found himself seeing these artisans not as mere subjects whose labor enriched his treasury, but as masters of their crafts, worthy of respect and admiration. The markets became playgrounds for their curiosity as merchants from distant lands displayed goods that spoke of worlds beyond Uruk's walls, spices from mountain kingdoms that burned the tongue with exotic fire, textiles woven in patterns that told stories of foreign gods and heroes, precious stones that caught the light and threw it back in colors that had no names in their language. Each discovery became a shared joy, each wonder doubled by having someone to appreciate it with. But it was in the evenings, when they climbed to the highest towers of the palace and looked out over the city they both now served in their different ways, that their friendship deepened beyond the bonds forged in combat. Here, away from the eyes of subjects and servants, they could speak freely of the burdens and gifts that came with their divine heritage. Gilgamesh spoke of the loneliness that had driven him to cruelty, the terrible isolation of being stronger than everyone around him, faster in thought, more acute in perception. He described the gradual process by which the adulation of subjects had transformed into something poisonous, how the constant deference had convinced him that other people were somehow less real than himself, less worthy of consideration. Enkidu shared his own struggles with the transition from wild freedom to civilized responsibility. He spoke of dreams where he ran with the herds again, of moments when the walls of the city felt like a cage, of the difficulty of learning to think in terms of consequences and complications, rather than the simple rhythms of natural existence. Yet he also expressed wonder at the achievements of human cooperation, the way individual skills could combine to create beauties that no single person could imagine. Their conversations ranged across every subject that minds touched by divinity might explore. They debated the nature of justice and mercy, the relationship between strength and wisdom, the proper use of power in a world where the strong could so easily dominate the weak. They shared memories of their different childhoods, Gilgamesh raised in luxury and ceremony, Enkidu nurtured by the wild creatures of forest and plain. Most importantly, they began to dream together of what they might accomplish with their combined strengths. Gilgamesh's knowledge of statecraft and military strategy, paired with Enkidu's understanding of the natural world and its hidden ways, suggested possibilities that excited both their imaginations and stirred their divine blood to greater purpose. It was during one of these evening conversations, as they watched the sun set beyond the walls of Uruk and paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, that Gilgamesh first spoke of the cedar forest. His voice carried a note of longing that Enkidu had never heard before, a hunger for something that transcended the pleasures and responsibilities of earthly kingship. The cedar forest lay far to the northwest, beyond the reach of any earthly kingdom, in lands where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of the gods grew thin and permeable. Ancient stories spoke of trees so tall they brushed the bellies of clouds, so old they remembered the first days of creation, so sacred that their resin was prized above gold in the temples of distant cities. But the forest was not unguarded. Ancient powers protected it from the axes of mortals. forces that had been old when the first cities were young, entities that served the will of the gods in maintaining the boundaries between what belonged to humanity and what must remain forever beyond their reach. The greatest and most terrible of these guardians was Humbaba, a creature of such fearsome aspect that even the bravest warriors spoke his name in whispers. Descriptions of Humbaba varied depending on who told the tale, but all agreed that he was something beyond mortal comprehension. Some claimed he was a giant whose footsteps left craters in solid stone, whose breath could wither forests, and whose roar could bring down mountains. Others insisted he was a demon clothed in flames that burned without consuming, whose eyes were like furnaces, and whose touch meant instant death. What all the stories shared was the certainty that Humbaba was invincible, that no mortal weapon could harm him, that no strategy could overcome his vigilance. The cedar forest had remained inviolate since the dawn of time, because its guardian was a force of nature itself, appointed by the gods to ensure that some places remained forever wild, forever beyond the ambitions of civilization. Yet, as Gilgamesh spoke of this distant wilderness and its terrible guardian, his eyes shone with an excitement that transformed his entire being. Here was a challenge worthy of his divine strength, an adventure that would test everything he had learned about courage and friendship. Here was an opportunity to accomplish something that would echo through the ages, to create a legend that would outlast the walls of Uruk itself. Enkidu listened to these descriptions with growing fascination and mounting concern. His wild upbringing had taught him to respect the guardians of sacred places, to understand that some boundaries existed for reasons that transcended human ambition. The thought of challenging such ancient powers stirred something deep within him, a recognition that they would be attempting something that might fundamentally alter their relationship with the divine forces that had shaped their destinies. But as he watched his friend's face glow with the prospect of this ultimate adventure, Enkidu felt his own divine blood beginning to sing with anticipation. Whatever the dangers, whatever the consequences, he could not imagine allowing Gilgamesh to face them alone. Their friendship had been forged in the crucible of combat, but it would be tested and proven in the furnace of shared peril. The planning for their expedition began the next morning, conducted with the same thorough attention to detail that Gilgamesh had once devoted to military campaigns against human enemies. But this would be unlike any war the king had ever waged. They would be traveling beyond the edges of civilization, into lands where the very air might be hostile to human breath, where streams might flow with poison, and the ground itself might rebel against their footsteps. The first challenge lay in the sheer distance they would have to cover. The cedar forest lay weeks of hard travel beyond the furthest reaches of Uruk's territory, through desert wastes and mountain passes that few mortals had ever attempted to cross. They would need supplies for an extended journey, equipment that could withstand extremes of heat and cold, weapons forged to specifications that went beyond anything required for ordinary warfare. Gilgamesh summoned the finest smiths in his kingdom and set them to work creating weapons worthy of gods. They crafted swords whose blades were longer than a tall man's height, axes whose heads were broad as shields, spears whose points could pierce the hide of dragons. Each weapon was forged with ceremonies that invoked divine blessing, tempered in waters drawn from sacred springs, polished until their surfaces reflected light like captured starfire. The armor they commissioned was equally magnificent, designed to protect against threats both physical and supernatural. Bronze plates shaped to follow the contours of their divine physiques, reinforced with prayers hammered into the metal itself. Helmets that would shield not just their heads, but their minds from the bewildering magics they might encounter. Shields large enough to shelter ordinary men, light enough for gods to wield with ease. But beyond weapons and armor, they needed knowledge. Gilgamesh consulted with the wisest scholars in his kingdom, men who had spent their lives studying the ancient texts that preserved memories of the world's earliest days. From them he learned what little was known about the approaches to the cedar forest, the landmarks that might guide their path, the rituals that might protect them from the hostile forces they would encounter. The priests of various temples contributed their own wisdom, sharing protective prayers and ward signs that might shield the travelers from supernatural harm. They provided amulets carved from stones that had never seen sunlight, blessed oils that could consecrate campsites in unholy ground, incense that could purify air tainted by demonic presence. Most valuable of all were the contributions of the few survivors who had attempted similar journeys in the distant past. Old men whose eyes held shadows of memories they preferred not to revisit, whose voices dropped to whispers when they spoke of the terrible beauties they had glimpsed in the wild places beyond civilization. Their warnings were as valuable as their encouragement, their failures as instructive as any success might have been. From these consultations emerged a picture of the journey ahead that was both thrilling and terrifying. They would travel first through familiar territory, following trade routes that connected Uruk with its outlying settlements and allied cities. But eventually, these safe paths would peter out, leaving them to navigate by star and instinct, through lands where human feet had seldom trod. The desert crossing would test their endurance against heat that could kill, and cold that could freeze blood in veins. Mountain passes would challenge their climbing skills, while exposing them to avalanches and predators that had never learned to fear human weapons. Rivers might run backwards, valleys might shift their shapes between sunset and dawn. The very stars might wheel in unfamiliar patterns as they entered regions where natural law gave way to older, stranger forces. Yet, for all the dangers, for all the rational arguments against attempting such a journey, both friends felt their hearts lifting with anticipation as the day of departure approached. They had found in each other the courage to attempt impossibilities, the strength to challenge even the decrees of fate itself. Together they were more than the sum of their individual powers, more than even gods might reasonably be expected to achieve alone. The night before their departure, they climbed once more to the highest tower of the palace and looked out over the city that had been the stage for their meeting and the birthplace of their friendship. Uruk spread below them like a jewel set in the darkness, its streets glowing with the warm light of oil lamps and cooking fires, its walls standing proud and strong against the star-filled desert night. Citizens moved through those streets with a freedom they had not known in years, their voices carrying laughter and song instead of whispers and complaints. The transformation in their king had rippled outward through every level of society, creating changes that would endure long after the heroes themselves had departed on their quest. Children played games that celebrated friendship and courage, rather than conquest and domination. Merchants conducted business with fairness rather than exploitation. Even the guards at the gates had begun to smile at travelers, rather than scowling with automatic suspicion. This was their legacy, already established before their greatest adventure had even begun. They had proven that strength could serve love rather than fear, that power could be used to protect rather than oppress, that even the mightiest could be made better through friendship and mutual understanding. Whatever happened in the cedar forest, whatever fate awaited them in their confrontation with Humbaba, they had already achieved something worthy of immortal remembrance. But as they stood there in the warm desert wind, breathing the familiar sense of home and listening to the peaceful sounds of their city settling into sleep, both friends felt the same irresistible pull toward the unknown that had driven heroes since the world began. They had tasted the satisfaction of using their strength for good, rather than selfish pleasure, and now they hungered for challenges that would test the full measure of what they might accomplish together. The cedar forest called to them across the miles, promising trials that would prove their worth not just to themselves and their people, but to the gods themselves. In seeking to claim timber from the sacred groves, they would be challenging the very order that kept mortals in their proper place, asserting their right to stand as equals with the divine powers that had shaped their destinies. It was a presumption that might destroy them, a hubris that could bring down the wrath of heaven itself upon their heads. But it was also an opportunity to transcend the limitations that bound ordinary mortals to achieve something that would echo through the ages as proof that friendship and courage could overcome even the most impossible obstacles. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of pearl and rose gold, the two friends made their final preparations for departure. Their weapons gleamed with oil and blessing, their armor fit like second skin. Their supplies were packed with the careful attention of those who understood that survival might depend on having the right tool at the right moment. The people of Uruk gathered to see them off, lining the streets from palace to gate in a procession of good wishes and anxious prayers. The young bride, whose wedding had been the occasion of their first meeting, scattered flower petals in their path, her face radiant with gratitude for the mercy that had saved her from royal violation. Her husband stood beside her, his own eyes bright with admiration for the king who had chosen friendship over tyranny. Old men who remembered the early days of Gilgamesh's reign wept openly at the sight of their transformed ruler, while young men gazed upon the departing heroes with eyes full of dreams and aspirations. Children pressed forward to touch the armor and weapons of these living legends, hoping that some portion of their courage and strength might transfer through contact. But it was the priests and wise men who offered the most valuable gifts, final blessings, and protective charms that might shield the travelers from the supernatural dangers they would face. They spoke prayers in languages older than memory, invoking powers that had watched over heroes since the world was young, asking for divine protection while acknowledging the terrible risks their champions were accepting. As the great gates of Uruk swung open and the two friends stepped out into the desert morning, they carried with them not just their weapons and supplies, but the hopes and dreams of everyone who believed that courage could triumph over fear, that friendship could overcome any obstacle, that even the gods themselves might be impressed by mortals who dared to reach for greatness. The sun climbed higher as they walked westward into the empty lands, their shadows stretching long behind them toward the city they were leaving. With each step, they moved further from the safety of civilization and closer to the realm where legend and reality merged, where the actions of heroes could reshape the very foundations of existence. Behind them, Uruk continued its daily life, but changed forever by the friendship that had transformed a tyrant into a hero, a wild man into a loyal companion, two isolated souls into something greater than the sum of their separate strengths. Their story was just beginning, but already it had proven that the greatest adventures start not with quests for treasure or glory, but with the simple miracle of finding someone who understands what it means to be truly human. In a world that demands both strength and compassion, the desert stretched endlessly before them, empty and challenging, leading toward mysteries that would test every aspect of their divine heritage and mortal determination. But they walked into that vastness without fear, for they walked together. And together, they had already accomplished the impossible task of transforming hatred into love, loneliness into companionship, the abuse of power into its proper use. Whatever waited for them in the cedar forest, whatever trials Humbaba might devise, whatever judgment the gods might pass upon their presumption, they would face it as they had faced everything since that night in the wedding hall, when combat had revealed the deeper truth of their brotherhood. They would face it together, as equals, as friends, as two who had become one while remaining eternally, magnificently themselves. The Epic of Gilgamesh continued to unfold with each step they took into the unknown, carrying them toward adventures that would echo through eternity, towards sorrows that would break their hearts and joys that would lift their spirits beyond the reach of earthly concerns, toward the ultimate test of what it means to be both human and divine in a universe that offers no guarantees except the promise that courage, love, and friendship can transform even the darkest story into something beautiful enough to remember forever. The first days of their journey across the desert passed in a rhythm as old as the world itself. Each morning they rose before dawn, when the air still held the cool memory of night and the eastern horizon wore its crown of pale gold. They would break their fast on dried meat and barley cakes, wash with precious water from their leather skins, and set out while the sand still bore the silver tracks of nocturnal creatures who had retreated to their hidden places before the sun's punishing gaze. Enkidu proved to be the perfect companion for such travel. His years in the wilderness had taught him to read the desert's moods like a shepherd reads the faces of his flock. He could sense water beneath the sand by the way certain plants grew, could predict the coming of sandstorms hours before they appeared on the horizon, could find shelter in landscape that seemed utterly barren to civilized eyes. His knowledge complemented Gilgamesh's own skills, creating a partnership that transformed the harsh journey into something approaching pleasure. The king, meanwhile, revealed depths of character that his years of tyranny had hidden even from himself. Away from the corrupting influence of absolute power, freed from the need to maintain the facade of invincible authority, he became the companion that nature had always intended him to be. His divine strength served not to dominate, but to protect, carrying extra water when Enkidu grew weary, sharing his cloak when desert nights turned bitter cold, using his keen intelligence to solve the countless small problems that threatened to transform inconvenience into catastrophe. They spoke little during the heat of the day, conserving both breath and moisture while they navigated the shifting landscape of dunes and rocky outcroppings. But as evening approached and they made camp in whatever shelter they could find, their conversations resumed with the easy intimacy of brothers who had known each other since childhood. They shared stories of their different upbringings, compared the lessons learned in palace and wilderness, debated questions of philosophy and governance that would have challenged the wisest scholars in Uruk. Enkidu spoke of the profound silence that filled the wild places during the deepest hours of night, when even the hunting cats padded softly and the wind held its breath in reverence for mysteries older than speech. He described the way morning light transformed familiar landscapes into wonderlands of gold and shadow, how each sunrise brought discoveries that made the world seem newly created. His words painted pictures of a paradise where strength served life rather than conquering it, where every creature knew its place in the great pattern of existence. Gilgamesh, in turn, shared memories of the burden that came with divine blood flowing in mortal veins. He spoke of the terrible loneliness that accompanied strength beyond measure, the gradual realization that his power set him apart from everyone around him, the slow corruption that came when no voice dared contradict his will. But he also remembered moments of genuine connection, times when his authority had been used to protect rather than exploit, glimpses of what kingship could become when guided by wisdom rather than appetite. Their friendship deepened with each shared hardship, each moment of mutual dependence. When a sandstorm caught them far from shelter, they pressed close together and created a cave of their bodies and cloaks, sharing warmth and breath while the desert raged around them like a living thing intent on their destruction. When water ran low and their throats cracked with thirst, they rationed their precious supply with the discipline of brothers who trusted each other's judgment absolutely. The nights brought their own challenges and revelations. Desert cold bit deeper than mountain wind, seeping through clothing and armor to chill the very marrow of their bones. They learned to build fires that burned hot and clean, conserving fuel while maximizing warmth. They took turns standing watch, scanning the star-drunk darkness for the gleaming eyes of predators, or the subtle movements that might betray human enemies. But the greatest gift of those desert nights was the silence that surrounded them, like a vast cathedral of space and starlight. Here, far from the sounds of civilization, they could hear the deep rhythms of the world itself, the slow breathing of the earth as it turned through its ancient dance. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that spoke of journeys beyond imagination, of distances that dwarfed even their own ambitious quest, of time measured not in years, but in the lives and deaths of suns. During one such night, as they sat beside their small fire and watched meteors streak across the darkness like messages from distant gods, Enkidu spoke of dreams that had been visiting him since they left Uruk. In these visions, he saw the cedar forest not as a place of terror, but as a sanctuary where the divine and mortal worlds touched and merged. He glimpsed trees whose roots reached down to the very foundations of existence, whose branches supported the architecture of heaven itself. But mixed with these images of beauty came darker visions, scenes of destruction and loss that made his heart race with nameless dread. He saw himself standing in a place of shadows, heard voices calling his name from directions he could not identify, felt the touch of hands that were neither warm nor cold, but somehow beyond the reach of earthly sensation. These dreams carried warnings he could not interpret, messages encoded in symbols his conscious mind refused to decipher. Gilgamesh listened to these accounts with the careful attention of a commander receiving intelligence reports from scouts who had penetrated enemy territory. His own sleep had been troubled by similar visions, though his dreams focused less on the mystical aspects of their quest and more on its practical dangers. He saw armies of supernatural beings arrayed against them, weapons that could cut through divine flesh as easily as mortal, traps that exploited their greatest strengths by turning them into fatal weaknesses. Yet neither friend suggested abandoning their mission. The dreams, however ominous, only confirmed what they had always known. They were attempting something unprecedented, challenging forces that had remained unchallenged since the world began. The very fact that their sleep was troubled by prophetic visions proved the cosmic significance of their undertaking. They were not simply two warriors seeking glory, but instruments of change in a universe that had grown too comfortable with ancient boundaries. As they traveled deeper into the wilderness, the landscape itself began to change in ways that spoke of their approach to realms where different laws held sway. The sand grew darker, shot through with veins of mineral that caught the light and threw it back in colors that had no names. Plants appeared that Enkidu had never seen during his years of wild wandering, thorny growths that seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythms, flowers that bloomed only in darkness and withered at the touch of dawn. The very air grew thicker, charged with energies that made their divine blood sing with recognition and anticipation. Sounds carried farther than they should, echoing off invisible barriers that bent the normal rules of distance and direction. Sometimes they heard music drifting across the desert, melodies played on instruments that no human hand had ever crafted, harmonies that spoke of joys and sorrows beyond mortal comprehension. Water sources became stranger as they progressed, springs that bubbled up from depths no earthly well had ever reached, streams that flowed uphill without apparent cause, pools that reflected not the sky above, but scenes from times and places far removed from the desert around them. They drank carefully from these supernatural sources, blessing each sip with prayers that acknowledged the sacred nature of what sustained them. Animals began to appear that belonged to no earthly taxonomy, creatures that watched them with intelligence too keen for beasts, too alien for humans. Some were beautiful beyond description, with coats that shifted color like oil on water and eyes that held the depth of eternity. Others were terrible to behold, amalgamations of familiar forms combined in ways that challenged sanity and suggested powers that delighted in chaos for its own sake. Yet none of these strange beings offered them harm. Instead, they seemed to recognize something in the two travelers that commanded respect, a quality that transcended species and reached into the realm where all consciousness touched the divine source. The beautiful creatures watched with approval that needed no words to convey its meaning. The terrible ones withdrew with what might almost have been salutes, acknowledging fellow powers even as they made clear their own strength. Through all these wonders and terrors, the bond between the two friends only grew stronger. Each strange encounter became a shared experience that deepened their understanding of each other and their mission. They learned to communicate without words when words might carry too far in the charged atmosphere, developed signals and gestures that conveyed complex thoughts with perfect clarity. Their movements synchronized until they seemed less like two individuals and more like aspects of a single entity, dedicated to a purpose that transcended personal desire. The mountains appeared gradually, first as a blue smudge on the northern horizon, then as a wall of stone that grew taller and more imposing with each day's march. These were not the familiar peaks that ringed Uruk's territory, worn smooth by ages of wind and rain, and shaped by forces that followed predictable patterns. These mountains thrust upward with the violence of recent creation, their surfaces raw and sharp as broken glass, their slopes defying every law of stability and proportion. Clouds clung to their peaks like living things, writhing and reshaping themselves in patterns that suggested intelligence behind their movements. Lightning played constantly among their summits, not the brief flashes of ordinary storms, but sustained displays of power that painted the stone in colors of fire and shadow. Thunder rolled down their flanks like the voices of sleeping titans, speaking in languages older than human speech. As they drew closer to these impossible peaks, both friends felt the weight of their quest settling upon them with new gravity. The playful aspects of their desert journey, the easy camaraderie of shared discovery, gave way to something more focused and determined. They were approaching the threshold between the world they knew and the realm where their courage would face its ultimate test. The foothills proved almost as challenging as the peaks themselves. Valleys twisted in directions that seemed to violate the basic geometry of space, leading them in circles that somehow brought them closer to their destination with each revolution. Streams flowed upward along cliff faces, defying gravity with the casual indifference of forces that recognized no earthly authority. Plants grew in configurations that formed symbols and patterns, as if the very landscape was trying to communicate messages in a language just beyond their comprehension. They climbed steadily through this maze of stone and impossibility, their divine strength tested not by the mere physical demands of the ascent, but by the psychological pressure of existing in a place where familiar reality bent and twisted like heated metal. Each step forward required an act of will, a conscious decision to continue despite every instinct that screamed of danger ahead. But they pressed on, drawn by the certainty that their destiny lay beyond these peaks, in the sacred grove where Humbaba kept his eternal vigil. The cedar forest called to them with voices that spoke directly to their divine heritage, promising challenges worthy of their strength, revelations that would justify every risk they had accepted in coming this far from home. The air grew thin as they climbed higher, but their lungs adapted to the change with the efficiency of bodies designed for more than mortal limitations. Their pace never slowed, their determination never wavered. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now, regardless of what terrors might await them in the realm beyond the clouds. And as they climbed toward the pass that would lead them to the cedar forest, both friends felt the same mixture of anticipation and dread that comes to those who stand on the threshold of legend. They were about to enter a place where their actions would echo through eternity, where the choices they made would determine not just their own fates, but the very nature of the relationship between gods and mortals. Behind them lay the world of cities and kings, of laws and customs, and the comfortable certainties that came with accepting the boundaries that others had established. Ahead lay the unknown, the untested, the realm where only the bravest dared to venture and only the strongest could hope to survive. They walked toward it together, as they had walked toward everything since that night when combat had revealed the deeper truth of their brotherhood, ready to face whatever waited for them in the sacred shadows of the cedar forest. The pass between the peaks opened before them, like the mouth of some primordial cave, its walls carved from stone that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Wind howled through this gateway with voices that spoke in harmonies no mortal throat could produce, carrying scents of resin and growing things from the hidden valley beyond. The very air shimmered with potential, thick with the breath of trees that had been ancient when the first cities rose from river mud. As they stepped through this threshold between worlds, both friends felt the change immediately. The weight of ordinary reality fell away like a discarded cloak, replaced by something far more fluid and alive. Colours became more vivid. Sounds carried layers of meaning that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. And every breath brought awareness of life forces that pulsed through the earth beneath their feet. The cedar forest spread before them in a display of natural majesty that reduced even their divine senses to wonder and humility. Trees rose toward the heavens like living pillars, their trunks so vast that 20 men holding hands could not have encircled their bases, their heights lost in canopies that seemed to brush against the very vault of sky. The air beneath their branches glowed with a green twilight that transformed ordinary vision into something approaching prophecy, revealing layers of existence that remained hidden in the mundane world. Every breath carried the perfume of cedar resin, rich and cleanurity. This was the scent that, an intoxicating in its pea, had driven kings to bankruptcy and merchants to madness, the fragrance that commanded prices beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. Here it flowed freely as air itself, a gift from trees that had been growing since the gods first dreamed of forests. The very ground exhaled aromatics that spoke of depths where roots touched the foundations of the world, drawing sustenance from sources that predated the separation of earth and heaven. No paths marked the forest floor, yet movement through this sacred space seemed guided by intelligence that recognized their purpose and approved their presence. Fallen needles created carpets softer than the finest silks, cushioning their steps while releasing fragrances that changed with each footfall. Streams of water clearer than crystal wound between the massive trunks, their sources hidden in the depths of the forest, their destinations lost in distances that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of any single world. The silence here was not the empty quiet of abandoned places, but rather the profound hush of a cathedral, where countless forms of life pursued their ancient purposes without need for words or explanations. Every rustle of needle against needle, every whisper of wind through branches, every distant call of creatures they could not identify, contributed to a symphony that spoke of harmony beyond human understanding. Enkidu moved through this wonderland with steps that grew more reverent with each passing moment. His wild upbringing had taught him to recognize sacred spaces, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the overwhelming sense of presence that filled this forest. These trees were more than plants, more than mere collections of wood and leaf and bark. They were living repositories of memory, witnesses to epochs that stretched back to the very beginning of time. He pressed his palm against the bark of one ancient giant, feeling through that contact the slow pulse of sap that had been rising and falling through seasonal cycles since before his ancestors had learned to shape tools from stone. The tree's awareness touched his own, not in words or images, but in the deep recognition that passes between living things when pretense falls away and essential nature stands revealed. Gilgamesh walked beside his friend with equal wonder, though his amazement took a different form. Where Enkidu marveled at the natural perfection of this place, the king found himself awed by the implications of what they had discovered. Here was wealth beyond the dreams of empires, timber that could build palaces to shame the gods themselves, resources that could transform Uruk into the greatest city the world had ever known. Yet, as these thoughts formed in his mind, he felt a strange reluctance to pursue them. The majesty of the forest seemed to demand something more than mere exploitation, some response that went beyond the simple acquisition of material goods. These trees had stood here since the world was young, had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, had served purposes that transcended human ambition. To reduce them to mere building materials seemed suddenly as sacrilegious as melting down temple statues to mint common coins. The deeper they penetrated into the forest, the more apparent it became that they were not alone in this sacred space. Creatures moved in the shadows between the great trunks, beings that belonged to no earthly taxonomy, yet seemed perfectly at home in this realm where natural law bent to accommodate greater purposes. Some appeared almost human, tall figures that watched from distances that made details impossible to discern. Their presence felt rather than clearly seen. Others were clearly non-human, yet possessed of intelligence that gleamed in eyes that reflected the green twilight with knowing intensity. A stag with antlers that branched like silver trees stepped delicately across their path, its gaze holding depths that spoke of wisdom accumulated over centuries of existence. Birds with plumage that shifted color like living jewels called from branches high above, their songs carrying meanings that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the heart. None of these forest dwellers showed fear of the two intruders, yet neither did they offer welcome. Instead, they watched with the careful attention of sentries who had been posted to observe and report. Guardians whose duty required them to note every detail of this unprecedented visitation. Their presence served as a constant reminder that Gilgamesh and Enkidu were guests here, tolerated perhaps, but definitely not masters of this domain. As the day wore on and the green twilight deepened towards something approaching evening, though no sun was visible through the canopy above, the friends began to sense a change in the atmosphere around them. The forest's mood shifted subtly, the welcoming curiosity of their arrival giving way to something more watchful, more tense. The creatures that had observed their passage began to withdraw deeper into the shadows, and even the wind through the branches seemed to carry warnings in languages they could not quite comprehend. They had been walking for hours through landscape that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. Yet somehow they both knew they were approaching their destination. The trees ahead grew even larger, their spacing more deliberate, as if they formed the outer courts of some vast, natural cathedral. The streams converged into a single waterway that flowed with the measured pace of a ceremonial procession, its surface reflecting not the canopy above, but depths that seemed to contain their own source of light. The scent of cedar resin grew stronger, almost overwhelming in its intensity, joined now by other fragrances that spoke of flowers that bloomed only in sacred groves, of fruits that nourished beings whose nature transcended ordinary flesh and blood. The very air seemed to thicken with significance, every breath carrying awareness that they stood on the threshold of an encounter that would determine not just their own fates, but the future relationship between mortal ambition and divine authority. It was Enkidu who first sensed the presence they had come so far to challenge. His wild, trained senses, attuned to the subtle signs that spoke of predators and dangers, detected something that made the hair on his arms rise and his divine blood sing with recognition of power that matched and perhaps exceeded his own. He stopped abruptly, one hand raised to halt his companion, his entire being focused on threat assessment and preparation for conflict. Gilgamesh felt it too. A moment later, a pressure in the air that spoke of attention turned their way, of intelligence vast and ancient, examining them with the thoroughness of a craftsman studying raw materials for some great work. The sensation was not entirely unpleasant, but it carried implications that made both friends check their weapons and adjust their stance in preparation for whatever was about to unfold. The forest around them fell completely silent, as if every living thing had suddenly held its breath in anticipation. Even the stream stopped its murmuring, its surface becoming mirror-still in the space between one moment and the next. The green twilight deepened to something approaching darkness, yet visibility somehow remained clear, as if their eyes had been granted the ability to see by light that existed beyond the normal spectrum. And then he appeared. Humbaba stepped from between the trees with the casual authority of one who had never been challenged in his own domain, never been forced to explain his presence or justify his actions. His form defied easy description, shifting between shapes that mortal eyes could comprehend and configurations that existed on the edges of nightmare and vision. At one moment, he appeared as a giant of roughly human proportions, his height equal to the smaller trees around him, his build suggesting strength that could reshape mountains with casual effort. In the next instant, his appearance would shift, revealing aspects that belonged to no earthly creature. His face might show features carved from living stone, eyes that burned with fires that consumed nothing, a mouth that spoke in voices like distant thunder. His hands would become claws capable of rending bronze like cloth, then transform again into appendages that seemed crafted from the living wood of the forest itself, bark-covered and moss-adorned, yet flexible as flesh and stronger than any metal. His hair flowed around his shoulders, like a waterfall of darkness shot through with veins of gold and silver that caught the strange light and threw it back in patterns that hurt to follow with ordinary vision. Garments that might have been woven from shadows and starlight draped his massive frame, shifting with his movements in ways that suggested they were part of his being rather than mere clothing. But it was his eyes that held their attention most completely. Ancient beyond measure, filled with the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of countless ages, they looked upon the two intruders with expression that combined curiosity, amusement, and something that might have been pity. Here was a being who had watched the rise and fall of civilizations, who had seen heroes come and go like flowers blooming and withering in a single season, who understood the futility of mortal ambition while respecting the courage it took to pursue the impossible. When Humbaba spoke, his voice carried the authority of wind through stone, the patient power of roots breaking through bedrock, the inexorable force of seasons turning in their eternal cycle. His words seemed to come from multiple directions at once, surrounding the two friends with sound that bypassed their ears and resonated directly through their bones. "So," he said, and the single syllable contained volumes of meaning. "The king of Uruk comes at last to my domain, bringing with him the wild one who has learned the ways of civilization. I have been expecting you since before your first breath, have known of your coming since the clay was first gathered for your making. The question that remains is why you have chosen to seek me here, in the heart of the sacred grove that has remained inviolate since the world was young." Neither friend found immediate words to answer this greeting that was simultaneously welcome and challenge. The presence of Humbaba was overwhelming, not through any sense of immediate threat, but through the sheer weight of his existence, the accumulated authority of one who had served as guardian of sacred things since time immemorial. To speak in his presence felt like a presumption that required justification they were not certain they possessed. Yet Gilgamesh had not become king of the greatest city in the world by allowing himself to be intimidated, even by powers that transcended mortal understanding. Drawing upon reserves of courage that reached back to his divine heritage, he stepped forward and met Humbaba's ancient gaze with eyes that reflected their own inner fire. "We come seeking timber for a great work," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the strange acoustics of the sacred grove. "The city of Uruk requires cedar for temples that will honor the gods and palaces that will house justice. We do not come as conquerors seeking to despoil your realm, but as builders hoping to create something worthy of the materials we would claim." Humbaba's expression shifted subtly, amusement flickering across features that seemed to be carved from the living stone of mountains. "Timber," he repeated, the word carrying echoes that suggested he found something deeply ironic in this explanation. "You have traveled beyond the edges of the world, passed through realms where mortal flesh should not survive, entered the heart of the sacred forest, all for timber." The guardian began to circle them with steps that made no sound on the needle-covered ground, his movement fluid as water yet purposeful as a hunting cat stalking prey. "Tell me, King of Uruk, what makes you believe that these trees, which have grown here since before your ancestors learned to shape mud into bricks, should fall to serve your architectural ambitions? What authority do you claim that supersedes the divine mandate that placed me here to preserve this grove against exactly such desires?" And Enkidu felt the challenge in these words, heard the undertone that suggested this conversation was merely prelude to conflict that had been inevitable since they first set foot in the forest. His wild nature, which had learned to recognize the moment when negotiation gave way to action, stirred in response to cues that spoke of predator and prey, hunter and quarry, challenger and defender of territory. Yet something in Humbaba's manner suggested that this encounter might unfold along lines more complex than simple combat. The Guardian's questions seemed genuine, as if he truly wished to understand the motivations that had driven two divine beings to undertake such an impossible journey. His circling movement, while clearly tactical in nature, also carried elements of ritual, as if they were all participants in some ceremony that required careful observation of ancient protocols. "We claim no authority beyond that which courage grants to those who dare to dream of greatness," Enkidu replied, his voice steady despite the supernatural pressure that surrounded them. "We seek these trees not for mere ornamentation, but to create monuments that will inspire generations yet unborn, structures that will remind mortals of what they might achieve when they reach beyond the limitations others would place upon them." The Guardian paused in his circling, his ancient eyes studying the wild man with new interest. "Courage," he repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it unexpectedly flavorful. An interesting quality to claim as justification for violating sacred boundaries. And what of wisdom? What of respect for powers greater than yourselves? What of understanding that some things exist beyond the reach of mortal ambition, regardless of how divine that ambition might be? The questions hung in the air between them like weapons balanced on the edge of release, each word weighted with implications that could tip their encounter toward cooperation or destruction. Both friends felt the moment stretching taut around them, pregnant with possibilities that could reshape not just their own destinies, but the very nature of the relationship between mortals and the divine powers that governed the world. Gilgamesh looked into Humbaba's eyes and saw reflected there the same hunger for meaning that had driven him from his palace in Uruk, the same search for purpose that had transformed his tyranny into friendship and his isolation into brotherhood. Behind the Guardian's words lay not simple opposition to their quest, but a deeper question about what they hoped to achieve through their presumption, what they believed they could create that would justify the risks they had accepted in coming here. The king of Uruk straightened to his full height, drawing upon every lesson in leadership and diplomacy that his divine heritage and royal training had provided. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction, the authority of one who had looked into his own soul and found there purposes that transcended personal desire. "We seek to build bridges," he said, his voice ringing through the sacred grove with the clarity of bronze bells. "Bridges between earth and heaven, between mortal aspiration and divine possibility, between what has always been and what might yet come to pass. These trees, if granted to us, will not be reduced to mere lumber but transformed into symbols of the marriage between human craft and divine gift, monuments that proclaim the possibility of cooperation between mortal and immortal realms." Humbaba stood motionless for a long moment, his ancient gaze shifting between the two friends as he weighed their words against intentions that only he could perceive. The forest around them remained locked in supernatural silence, as if the very trees were holding their breath while awaiting the Guardian's decision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried new undertones, notes of something that might have been approval, mixed with the eternal sadness of one who had watched too many noble intentions transform into tragic outcomes. "You speak well, King of Uruk. Your words carry the ring of sincerity, and your companion's courage shines like flame in darkness. Yet words are easily spoken, and intentions, however noble, can be corrupted by the very success they achieve." The Guardian raised one massive hand, and the friends felt power gathering around them like storm winds focused on a single point. "If you would claim timber from the sacred grove, you must first prove that your strength matches your ambition, that your courage equals your presumption. The trees you seek have grown here under my protection for ages beyond counting. They will not be given freely, but must be won through trial that tests not just your might, but your worthiness to bear the responsibility that comes with such gifts." Both friends felt their hearts lift with the warrior's joy that comes when uncertainty gives way to clear purpose, when complex negotiations resolve into the simple clarity of challenge and response. They had not come this far to be turned back by words, however wise, or warnings, however dire. They had come to test themselves against the ultimate guardian, to prove through deed rather than declaration that they possessed the strength and worthiness to claim what they sought. Weapons appeared in their hands, as if summoned by will alone, the bronze and iron they had commissioned in Uruk, gleaming with oil and blessing, sharp enough to cut through the very air around them. Their armour, crafted by the finest smiths in their kingdom, settled around their frames with the familiar weight of protection earned through foresight and preparation. Humbaba watched these preparations with the patient attention of one who had observed countless warriors ready themselves for battle, who understood that the ritual of arming was as important as the conflict itself. His own form seemed to solidify and grow more defined, shifting from the fluid multiplicity of shapes he had displayed to something approaching a single, focused configuration designed for combat. The Guardian became a being of living wood and stone, his flesh transformed into materials that belonged to the forest itself, while retaining the flexibility and intelligence that marked him as more than mere natural force. Bark covered his skin like armor that had grown rather than being forged, while his hands lengthened into claws that could rend bronze like parchment. His eyes blazed with fires that had burned since the world's beginning, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried the authority of mountains, speaking their ancient truths. "Come then, children of gods and clay," he said, raising arms that could have uprooted the mightiest trees with casual effort. "Show me the strength that brings you so far from home, the courage that drives you to challenge powers that have stood unchallenged since the dawn of time. Prove to me that your friendship can overcome obstacles that have defeated armies, that your combined might can achieve what neither could accomplish alone." The battle that erupted in the heart of the cedar forest was unlike any conflict that had ever shaken the world. Here was combat between beings whose strength transcended mortal limitations, whose speed made lightning seem sluggish, whose endurance could outlast the turning of seasons. The very ground trembled beneath the impact of their meeting, ancient trees swaying as forces beyond nature's normal scope clashed in their shadows. Gilgamesh struck first, his sword describing an arc of light as it cut through air thick with supernatural energy. The blade, forged with prayers and tempered in sacred waters, met Humbaba's clawed defense with a sound like thunder breaking over mountain peaks. Sparks flew from the contact, each one burning with its own inner fire, falling like stars to ignite the forest floor in patterns that spoke of cosmic significance. But the Guardian's strength proved equal to the challenge, his bark-covered arms absorbing the impact that would have shattered ordinary flesh and bone. His counterstrike came with the inexorable force of landslides, claws seeking the gaps in the king's armor, with precision born of ages spent protecting the sacred grove from all who would violate its sanctity. Enkidu joined the battle with the fluid grace of one whose combat style had been learned from the forces of nature themselves, his own weapons weaving patterns that complemented his friend's assault, while creating new angles of attack. Together, the two friends fought as they had learned to live, each anticipating the other's movements, each covering weaknesses that individual effort might have exposed. The forest around them became an arena worthy of such conflict, trees bending away from the violence while somehow managing to avoid the destruction that lesser timber would have suffered. The streams that flowed between their roots began to glow with light that seemed to rise from their depths, as if the very water were responding to the divine energies being unleashed in its presence. Creatures of the grove gathered at safe distances to witness this unprecedented spectacle, their eyes reflecting wonder and terror as they watched powers clash that had existed in balance since the world's youth. Birds that had never known fear took flight in spirals that painted the air with color, while ground-dwelling beasts pressed close to the earth as if seeking protection from forces that transcended their understanding. The battle raged through configurations of space that seemed to expand and contract around the combatants, as if the forest itself were adjusting its dimensions to accommodate conflict of such scope and intensity. What should have been a clearing between trees became an arena vast enough to contain their movements, while maintaining the intimate atmosphere of a sacred space where every action carried weight beyond its immediate physical effects. Humbaba fought with the patient strength of stone and the fluid adaptability of a living wood, his form shifting between configurations that maximized different aspects of his power. When speed was required, he became streamlined as wind through branches. When strength was needed, he assumed the solidity of mountains. His claws could extend to impossible lengths. His reach could encompass distances that defied normal geometry. His endurance seemed as limitless as the forest he protected. Yet gradually, almost imperceptibly, the combined assault of the two friends began to tell. Their coordination, perfected through the trials of their journey and the bonds of their friendship, created patterns of attack that even Humbaba's ancient wisdom could not completely counter. Where one friend engaged the guardian's attention, the other found opportunities for strikes that accumulated damage like drops of water wearing away stone. The end came not through any single decisive blow, but through the simple mathematics of endurance tested beyond even supernatural limits. Humbaba, for all his power, was ultimately a being tied to place and purpose, his strength drawn from the forest he protected. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, though perhaps individually less mighty, possessed the focused intensity of those whose strength came from shared determination and mutual support. And so, as your breathing deepens and your mind drifts toward the realm of dreams, you carry with you the echoes of humanity's first great story. The Epic of Gilgamesh, born from clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia, has whispered its truths across 4,000 years to reach your sleeping consciousness tonight. In its tale of friendship conquering tyranny, of courage challenging the impossible, of mortality teaching wisdom to the divine, you've experienced the very foundations upon which all stories rest. Sleep now, knowing that the greatest adventures begin not with quests for treasure or glory, but with the simple miracle of finding someone who truly understands what it means to be human.